Scripture lesson for today is found in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning with verse number 31. I was going to read it from this Bible, but I will read it from this Bible. Some of you probably have Bibles that look like this. This is the Common English Bible. It is an easier translation for many to understand. And so I begin with Matthew chapter 13, beginning with verse 31. Jesus told another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and planted in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when it's grown, it's the largest of all vegetable plants. It becomes a tree so that the birds in the sky come and nest in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast, which a woman took and hid in a bushel of wheat flour until the yeast had worked its way through all the dough. And then continuing at verse 44, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that somebody hid in a field, which someone else found and covered up. Full of joy, the finder sold everything and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one very precious pearl, he went and sold all that he owned and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that people threw into the lake and gathered all kinds of fish. When it was full, they pulled it to the shore, where they sat down and put the good fish together into containers. But the bad fish, they threw away. That's the way it will be at the end of the present age. The angels will go out and separate the evil people from the righteous people, and will throw the evil ones into a burning furnace. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. They said to him, yes. Then he said to them, therefore, every legal expert who has been trained as a disciple for the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household who brings old and new things out of their treasure chest. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today is the day my mother died. She died 16 years ago today. And that means it is a hard day for me. It is always a hard day. And even if my mind doesn't remember, the rest of me remembers. And this past week, I was not well. And it wasn't until I realized my body was remembering the death of my mother that I started to feel better. I share this because my mother was my anchor. She was the one who made me feel safe in this world. even if we were hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away from each other. And for my early adulthood, of course, my mother was in Thailand, and I was in the United States. But in a way, it was okay because my mother was in the world somewhere, and I felt that I could have faith, that I could trust, that I could get through every day in this life. It was very hard when I lost her. And some of you probably know what that is like. After my mother died, my father became my anchor. And as long as he was in the world somewhere, I felt safe, and I felt that I could trust and have faith. He died a year ago, and it has been hard. Many of you know what I'm saying. One thing that I seem to learn again and again in my life, or maybe I should say that I need to learn again and again in my life, is that I don't like living in faith. I don't particularly like living in faith and living in trust. I say that I am committed to being a person of faith, but I have learned that there are many times when it is not comfortable and it does not always feel safe. And something that you have probably heard before, and I will probably say it again because it's true. Preachers and pastors are often preaching to themselves because they need to hear the truth just as much as anyone else. I know I do. But it's an interesting thing about living in faith and trust. All of us actually do live in faith in some ways, whether we think we have faith or not. And why do I say that? We have faith that when we turn the faucet, there will be water. How does that happen? There's a whole lot of people working somewhere else in the city so that water can come through the pipes. And when we turn on a faucet, there's water. There are a whole lot of people working so that there is electricity, so that the water can be pumped into buildings. And we live in faith that that water is going to be at least clean enough to wash with. We also live in faith that we don't have to put hundreds and hundreds of pounds of rice away in our kitchen. We live in faith that the marketplace will be open. We live in faith that there will probably be a 7-Eleven in our neighborhood, and it will probably be open, and we'll probably be able to find food. Now, all the years I lived in the United States, sometimes you could not go out and buy food because there was so much snow on the ground, you couldn't get out. And I remember times when I could not open my front door for 2 or 3 days because there was so much snow. So it was good to have extra food in the kitchen or in the pantry. But most of us live in faith that we don't have to put away that much food. We can go out and get something. There's something out there. We all live in faith that when we press a switch, the lights will go on. How does that happen? 300 years ago, our ancestors would have thought it was magic. They might have been afraid. And we live in faith that when we plug the charger in, our cell phones, our mobile phones, will be recharged. These are all things where we have to trust other people that we've never met and we never will meet. All of those people who work on the electrical system, all of those people who work on the water system, all of those people who work at the 7-Eleven so that we can go and get something. We believe in a lot of things, and we believe that they're going to be there for us. Our cell phones are usually going to work. The radio station will probably be there when we turn on a radio. The TV station will probably be there if there's a TV and you can turn it on. So we all live with a lot of faith. We just don't always realize that's what you might call it, faith and trust. So I have a story to tell, a small story. At the time, it didn't feel small to me, but a few years ago, I was working as the pastor of a church in the United States, in the middle part of the country, in the state of Iowa, middle north. And one year, I went to church camp for a week, and I was at church camp with the young people, the teenagers, the high school youth. And that year, I had to leave church camp a little early because I also had to go to my General Assembly. Now, I know the Church of Christ in Thailand has a General Assembly meeting every 2 years, and people come from churches all over the country to that meeting for several days. Well, my denomination, my Christian group in the United States does that too, every 2 years. Only because the United States is so big, it moves around. And some years it's in one state, and some years it's in another state. And in that year, the General Assembly was hundreds of kilometers away from where I was. And my congregation required me to do both things, even though they overlapped with each other. Church camp wasn't over, but I had to go to General Assembly. I had to be at both things. And I checked with a number of my fellow pastors in the state where I worked, and I learned that a van full of people was going to be driving all the way from Iowa to Tennessee, those more than 1,000 kilometers, and that I could ride in that van. And it would be going on the day that I needed to go. A little bit late, but not too late. And this was good because I didn't want my little congregation to have to pay for an airplane ticket for me. And airplane tickets, as perhaps some of you know, are much more expensive in the United States than they are in Thailand. So I thought everything was going to be rip roy, everything was going to be in order, and I could go to this meeting. But there was a problem. As soon as I got into that van, traveling those 1,000 kilometers, I found out that they were going to leave the conference after only 2 days. I couldn't do that. I was a pastor. I had to be there to the very end. And by then it was going to be 4 more days. I could not come back with them. So there I was, more than 1,000 kilometers away from my home, and no way to get back. Now, in the United States, they have buses but they're not considered safe to travel in, usually. They have trains, but not everywhere. And if I had to buy an airplane ticket at the last minute, it would have cost 10 times as much as any airplane ticket here. Maybe 15 times as much. So, I was very far from home, and I had no way to get back at the end of the week. I thought, well, I could rent a car. That would cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and I would be driving 10 hours by myself. And it would hurt my congregation to have to spend that money. But while I was at that General Assembly, I found out that I really did have friends. Real friends who wanted to help me if they could. And every day while I was at that conference, someone would ask me, do you have a ride yet? I heard that you need a ride back to Iowa. Do you have a ride yet? Oh, we're leaving early. I'm sorry, we can't take you. But I hope you get a ride. And I think part of why that was hard for me was that I was a little bit like a Thai person. For those of you who do not know, I grew up in this country, and so I was Greng Chai. How do you say that in English? It's very hard to ask for something if you are Greng Chai. You don't want to impose on someone else. So here I was in America, looking like an American person, feeling very uncomfortable because I needed a big favor, and it was very uncomfortable having to ask for it. And the other thing that I need to tell you is that in the United States, even though people are often very kind and they have big hearts, they are not always as willing to take a passenger hundreds of miles in the way that someone in Thailand would. So there is a difference in our cultures. I think in the Thai culture there would be many people who would have offered me a ride. But in the American culture, your car is like your private room, you know? So, finally, on the very last morning of the big meeting, the General Assembly, finally, I heard that 2 people were driving to Iowa and I could ride in their car. Oh my goodness. It was a very nice car. I had the whole back seat all to myself. I could rest. And not only that, they didn't stop at McDonald's or KFC or any of those restaurants that have so much grease in their food. No, they stopped at real restaurants with vegetables, kun ma. They had vegetables. And they wouldn't let me pay for anything. Not for gasoline, not for all the times we stopped to eat something. I didn't know these people very well, but I did know them. But something else happened during that week when I was trying to be faithful and trying to believe that something as simple as a ride back to my home could happen. Every time I started to worry more than usual that week, I would meet someone that I hadn't seen in years. And this happens if you go to church meetings, big church meetings, if you've been active in your group for many years. You will have friends in other parts of the country. And every time I started to worry more than usual, I would see a friend I hadn't seen in years. And usually it was a good Christian friend, someone who had always encouraged me. And I felt as though even something as small as the friends I met each day were a gift from God to me. And the reason I bring that up is that when you live with a great deal of uncertainty for a short time or maybe a very long time, sometimes it is the things that seem very small that you see as a blessing. Just someone who remembered me and was glad to see me and had some Christian encouragement to offer. So what does any of that have to do with the parables of Jesus that we read about this morning? How does that story remind anybody of the story of the mustard seed? Faith that's even as small as a mustard seed, or faith like a very rare pearl, or faith like the smallest bit of yeast. That story that Jesus told about the yeast would have made the women laugh, because he was talking about yeast in maybe 150 pounds of flour, and most women were never going to make that much bread at one time. They would use a small amount of yeast in maybe this much flour, maybe a kilo, maybe less. He was talking about, 80 kilos and a little bit of yeast to make bread. Every parable that he told was about things that are hidden, things that you don't see easily. The very small seed of the mustard plant. Pearls, real pearls, of course, come from the bottom of the sea. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, the only way anyone could get a pearl was for some brave person somewhere to dive deep and bring up the oysters. Somebody had to be able to hold their breath for a very long time. I've read about the pearl divers of Japan and how I don't know if there are any anymore, but there was a time when they could dive so deep into the ocean and bring up the oysters that had pearls in them and hold their breath for such a long time until those oysters came up to the top. This is why pearls were so expensive in the ancient days, in the old days. So expensive. Because that was the only way to get one. It was very dangerous. So each one of these things is hidden. A pearl is hidden at the bottom of the sea. A little bit of yeast is something that you can't even see. In those days, they couldn't see the yeast. They had just a little piece of dough that was called sourdough, and the yeast was hiding in that little piece of dough that they would save for the next time they made bread. And then they would save from that for the next time they made bread. Every one of these parables that Jesus tells about what God's kingdom is like talked about something that's hiding, something that you don't see or almost don't see. But there's something else, too. Every one of those stories has a mystery in it, and by that I mean something that we still can't explain. What kind of magic makes a pearl inside an oyster? What kind of animal is that makes something so beautiful? What kind of magic is inside a seed that when it is planted in the ground, it knows how to grow? It knows how to find the light. It knows how to become a mustard plant, almost as big as a tree. What kind of magic is it that causes many, many fish to come by a boat so that the fishermen can catch them? In the ancient days, thousands of years ago, they didn't know. They just had to try. Maybe magic is the wrong word. It is God's mystery, the way God has made things. Things that seem to be very small, but grow and have a great effect. Yes, you can take a tiny bit of yeast and put it in 80 pounds of flour, 80 kilos of flour. It takes time, and faith takes time. It takes a lot of time. It takes patience. And don't you think it's true sometimes that the hardest things in our lives are not always the great sorrows, but the little things every day that can cause us to become irritated, to become annoyed, to get worried, to be short-tempered with other people in our life, to be impatient with other people, to try to control what is around us. And Jesus seems to be saying that the way to be joyful in this world that belongs to God comes out of very small beginnings, just a little bit of trust in God, just a little bit of faith. How long did the merchant have to search until he found a pearl that was worth everything to him? How long? How many searches? How many frustrations? How many days did he finish and say, no, nothing today, nothing today? How many times did the fishermen go out in their boat and come back with no fish? It takes a long time for yeast to make dough rise, to make bread. That's why most people don't make their own bread. They go and buy it at the 7. And nowadays, I understand a lot of people don't make their own rice anymore. I remember how it was when the rice was cooked over a charcoal pot, and it took time, and you had to know how to control the fire. Now, I don't even know how many people cook rice on their stove. You just put it in a rice cooker and push the button. Am I right? Yes? Or you go to the store and it comes in a little bowl and you put it in the microwave and it heats it up again. That's just wrong. Anyway, how long does it take for a tiny seed to become a great big plant? Sometimes our faith in God, only comes through having to be patient, being frustrated sometimes. Jesus said, don't worry, but I found that I was very good at worrying. It's still something that I'm very good at. And yet, when I look back in my life at the times when I was impatient and I was worried and I forgot that I am not supposed to be God, I am not supposed to be able to control the things that happen all around me, that God was at work. And things came together beautifully. I got a ride home from that meeting. I did not have to spend all of my little congregation's budget to do it. And so, I have to remind myself, can I be patient? Can I be hopeful? The next time I'm not sure how things are going to be, I have to ask myself that question. So what about you? Are there things that you find annoying? Things that you become impatient about in everyday life? Do you feel that you must try to control the people around you somehow? Jesus did tell us in this same Gospel of Matthew, in the 6th chapter, that worrying could never change one hair on your head from black to white, or white to black. So, what is the final word? I do have to live in faith. How about you?